Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host Laura Alonso, Rafael Di Tella, and Sergio Moro for a conversation moderated by Daniel Matamala on the lessons learned from the anti-corruption movement in Latin America. Before we begin, please note we are on the record and we will post the video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 15 minutes or so, and you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. As always, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope that you will join us for more upcoming webinars, so please check our website, our publication, promarket.org, and our Capitalism podcast, hosted by our faculty director, Luigi Zingales, and acclaimed investigative journalist Bethany McLean. And back to this afternoon, you have more information on our speakers on the event page, but please allow me to briefly introduce them. Laura Alonso is a Reagan-Fassel Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, and she previously served as the head of Argentina's Anti-Corruption Office and as a member of the Argentine Congress. Rafael Di Tella is the William Ziegler Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Sergio Moro is a university professor, a former federal judge, and former Minister of Justice and Public Security of Brazil. And our moderator, Daniel Matamala, is a journalist, author, and anchor on CNN Chile. He is also a 2018 Stigler Center Journalist and Residence Fellow. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Welcome, bienvenidos everybody to this webinar. According to Transparency International, around 56 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean paid a bribe in order to access a public service last year, with records of 50% in Venezuela and 34% in Mexico. A majority of the citizens in every country surveyed in Latin America think people risk retaliation if they speak out against corruption. 85% in Venezuela, 80% in Argentina believe so. We know it, a continent that is plagued by corruption. But in last years, we have been in the spotlight with an advance, the prosecution of cases that involve high-profile politicians and oligarchs. Lavallato, Odebrecht have been great tsunamis that overthrown governments, put former presidents in jail, and exposed big corruption networks in countries like Brazil, Peru, or Colombia, along with more local scandals like Cuadernos de las Coimas in Argentina, Penta, SQM, and Cabal in Chile, or the institutionalized corruption that we know exists in countries like Mexico, Honduras, or Venezuela. Can we learn any lessons from these investigations and the aftermath? That is what we will discuss in the following minutes with our guests. Please, 10 minutes each. I will warn when it's 1 minute left, so you can finish your idea in order to keep the punctuality of this webinar. And we will start with Laura Alonso. Laura, you have now your 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very honored to share this webinar with distinguished discussants. I also want to tell you that as I am affiliated as a Reagan-Fassel with the National Endowment for Democracy, all my opinions are mine. These remarks come from almost my 20 years experience as an activist, a lawmaker, and a policymaker in the good governance and anti-corruption field. In the last 3 decades, there has been a transnational movement to promote institutional reforms to prevent corruption. International and regional treaties were passed and ratified by almost every nation. Many peer review mechanisms were put in place. Some of them are terribly ineffective and need reform. The IMF has deepened its governance framework recently. How is it going to effectively address the issue of poor governance or corruption? Is the review of Article 4 enough? Multilateral development banks try to promote reforms indirectly. However, in many cases, they fund corruption in both public and private sectors. International aid has also been used as a source of corruption in developing countries, especially a fantastic source for dictators' pockets. A lot of policies were designed and implemented in many countries. Rankings and measurements were developed and even discussed till today and tomorrow. The private sector has introduced anti-corruption policies as well. Still, we are not satisfied because it's not enough. On top of this, the anti-corruption rhetoric has been weaponized nationally and internationally, eroding in many cases liberal democracies, where there are liberal democracies. It has also helped to increase citizens' lack of trust and disappointment with the rule of law. I have always thought that prevention is a more efficient investment than persecution of corruption. However, prevention has no press. All the political, journalistic, and public rhetoric about corruption is associated with punishments. And from my point of view, this is a problem. In Argentina, punishment of corruption has been very difficult and almost impossible. The judiciary has been historically politicized. Mistrust is very high, and impunity seems to be the norm. When a prosecutor or a judge do the right thing, they face a lot of, let's call them, odd situations. When evidence and confessions are exposed everywhere, politicization makes its job distorting what has been discovered. Also, fake news and not professional media make things look worse. Usually, investigative journalism has helped to unveil the truth, but the judiciary has disappointed in its resolution. This is not an easy struggle, and as liberal democracies are under siege in many countries, the anti-corruption movement is also in risk, and it's also being questioned. I think, and this comes from my experience, that a global reflection around the issue needs to be done, and the reframing of the agenda is mandatory if we do not want to be used against freedom. I have personally learned that perfect does not exist anywhere. The choice is usually a second best. However, progress can be done, and some rules were put in place. There have been efforts to support reforms from active civil society, some political understanding of the economic costs of corruption and inefficiency, and the right international pressure and cooperation. At transnational level, there are a lot of things to be reviewed with regards to money laundering and corruption, beneficial ownership, and the banking system. Still, I believe transparency in political finance, open data, digital government, integrity policies in the private and the public sector, investigative journalism, and active civil society and international cooperation are more needed than ever to restrict the field of the wrongdoers. Also, we have to learn how to use artificial intelligence in our own behalf. I have always felt that anti-corruption and integrity might be a lost cause, and we will probably never prevail. Still, some progress has been done. Less than 20 years ago, it was impossible to know in my country who were the members of Congress. 5 years ago in Argentina, it was impossible to know how many contracts were allocated every year by the federal government and to whom. 5 years ago, we were not able to know in Argentina how many employees were working, for example, in the office of the president, or how much federal money were transferred to the provinces. 10 years ago, we were not able to know the salary of a Supreme Court justice, or even the resume of the nominees to become justices. Now, at least, we know their faces, their names, the telephone numbers, where to call, where to write. Many things changed this year. I think that assessing the anti-corruption movement with a photogram may be misleading. And corruption can take many forms. also its fights. It is an ongoing process, like poverty reduction, like the defense of democracy. Anti-corruption never ends. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your initial statement. Now we are going to Sergio. Sergio. You're silent.
First of all, let me say that I'm grateful for the invitation. I'm honored here to share this panel with and Ms. Laura also. Important to speak about the anti-corruption movement in Latin America. I can speak a little about my view of this issue. I was one of the judges in charge of this operation, and usually in Brazil,
we have some problems to listen to you right now. Maybe we can start now with Rafael, and after that with Sergio when he can solve the problems, because we are not able to hear you. Just a moment, Rafael, and maybe after that Sergio can resume.
Perhaps it's just the microphone. Just the microphone, Sergio. Perhaps it's just the microphone.
No, it's open, the microphone here.
Now it's good.
Now we're listening to you. Now we're listening.
We're good. We're good. Yeah, better.
Go ahead.
Strange. Well, let me say first, repeating that I'm honored to be invited for this panel and to share it with the other distinguished guests. I was one of the in charge of the operation, and in region, like Argentina, Brazil, it was very hard to see those involved in corruption or other cases being persecuted.
Yeah, we're not able to correctly listen.
Strange. So maybe go to Rafael, and I enter later. I'll join again.
Yeah, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can do it. We will solve it with Sebastian and Rafael. Maybe you could, in order to keep the schedule.
Yes, I can do Sarasa.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a joke. It's an internal Argentinian joke. But anyway, so thanks very much for the invitation. I am really happy to be here and to join you guys on this webinar. So I guess I have a couple of points to make just to get the conversation started. So the first one, of course, is this general pessimism that we all have about the international movements to stop corruption. So corruption, as you guys all know, it came from when I was starting out in the 90s. We were all excited because corruption was going from the C word in, you couldn't even mention it in the World Bank or in other places because you thought that was going to get you into trouble, to something that was at the forefront of the institutional agenda. And it used to be a central part of the second generation reforms that the Washington Consensus was pushing around the world. And there were lots of good things that were being peddled then. And I think there was a lot of hope. And we were all kind of we knew that a big part of the strategy had to be more information, and we started computing this, corruption indices and gathering data, and we suddenly realized there was much more data available than what we thought. And I think that was a very big realization, and that was at the crux of that movement. We kind of knew that I think we were all really aware of the fact that there were risks in this approach. The corruption involved, sort of difficult choices. And for example, if you're going to be putting in anti-corruption initiatives in the second generation reforms, and you were going to do international aid conditional on this type of reforms, then you were getting dangerously into political matters, which the IMF and the World Bank might want to avoid. So we kind of knew that a lot of it was coming from the international, from the early experiences. I remember the one was called, what was it? The Hong Kong, ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption. And a lot of the issues that had to, that made the ICAC effective were a little complicated for everybody to embrace. And it involved kind of reversing the burden of proof, not doing exactly due process. It wasn't an accident that Hong Kong had a lot of limits on freedom at the time that the ICAC was pretty effective. So we all knew, but we thought the promises, the benefits outweighed the risks. I think I share like a bit of the pessimism that Laura was expressing, and I think my personal take is simply that a lot of the movement didn't live up to a lot of the promises, but I think the crux was on more information, and I think that panned out. There was more energy in trying to get more information to citizens, and that was, I think, put into place through different initiatives, some of the executives, some through other means. And I think that was a big change. Access to information, for example, changed radically in many different places. Sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. But I think that movement, the big thing it delivered is more information, but I don't know that it delivered great results. At the same time, let me just point out that there was always this tension between saying like, this person, Daniel, is corrupt, or versus the structure of like, the economic system in Chile or whatever is generating more corruption opportunities. And I always thought that it was extremely important to work on the latter if we were going to make real progress. And I think a lot of the work went into isolating the conditions that generated corruption opportunities. A lot of them was like discretion in procurement, more broadly, lack of competition in markets. Protectionism was another big one that generated rents out of which you could pay bribes, etc. Inflation, for example, which completely distorts witness prices or prices that you're going to be using for comparisons. And I think, but of course, the new technologies really are always a counterbalance, and there's always more and more availability of information, as Laura was pointing out, and that is a force for the better that I think was there. I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to make one extra point, which is that I think the big development since the 90s, in the last 20, 30 years, has been the rise of populism. We in Latin America have always been into the problems and the peculiarities of populism. And I think we understood always much better than the Americans today, and in the Europeans, about what is populism. So they always want to put populism on the left-right axis. And I think that's like a crucial mistake. I think the idea of populism is this peculiarity that is like this strange beliefs, things that we don't like kind of agree on. And like, traditionally, like, in economics, for example, we always think it's better to have somebody who's more knowledgeable or more, or an expert. And like, the populists caught on to the idea that not many people like experts. They think so that's like one interesting dimension. Another, of course, was this idea that they were anti-institutions. We think that, like, more independence of the judiciary is good. And the populists picked on the idea that, no, we don't agree on that. And that, and they addressed this interference with the judiciary through the ideas of judicial reforms. And I think that's been always a theme of populists. And this idea that it's not left-right or like, horizontal differentiation between parties, but vertical differentiation, that they propose something that we all agree it's worse. So it's vertical differentiation. So economists really can't explain that. we have a real difficulty in explaining why a customer would want a worse car, a car that is identical to everything the other car, but worse on the velocity, speed dimension. And that's kind of the proposition that populists bring to the table. And I think it's an interesting one. So just for the sake of this webinar, I think one aspect of why that dimension of populism occurs is this idea that they picked on this tension that, like, you want, you are like a liberal person, you want, like, this liberal institution, an institutionalist. You also have your ideology, and you are like, you find it more difficult to criticize your guy when the time comes. So a fundamental aspect that of the anti-corruption movement was that we were in there for corruption, and we were equally happy criticizing our government, the government with which you shared your opinion, than criticizing the other one. And I think that is something that is not like a natural thing. Even, we think lots of people are interested in corruption, but when you go to the heart of it, they think the corruption of the other guy is terrible, not the corruption of my guy. And I think that's like a fundamental tension, because of course we have like our ideology, but what's wrong with that? And we also would like to be like, more honest. And the problem is that when those two things collide, we really can't deal with that very well. We find it like disloyal. If you are a Macrista and you accuse Macri of, like, corruption, it's kind of seen as disloyal or bad, etc. The same thing with Kirchner. So that's kind of like the tension that is inherent. And I think some of the populists exploited this tension and this weakness in the anti-corruption movement to basically attack and do a backward movement in corruption. And I think the more explicit one is in the case of the Kirchners. The Kirchners are very explicit. The one interesting thing about it is that you do not have to do any investigation. You don't have to say anything. You just pick on what they say, and you have to admit that those numbers, those facts would implicate you in any other country. So that's like an extraordinary thing, and the combination of that revelation plus the fact that lots of people continue to support the populist movements really is a challenge that we don't have a good answer to in the anti-corruption movement.
Thank you very much, Rafael. We are back to you, Sergio.
Okay, let's try again. Let's see if it works now. Are you hearing me? Okay. First of all, let me say that I'm grateful for the invitation and to share this panel with other distinguished guests. It's a very important issue, the anti-corruption movement in Latin America. Years ago in Brazil, it was very difficult, as in other countries of the region, to have, for example, high politicians or powerful entrepreneurs being prosecuted for corruption or bribery. And even more hard was to see they suffering real punishment for their wrongdoing by the courts of law. Things start to change. 2012, with a huge case called Mensalão that was tried by our Supreme Court, because it involved high politicians who have in Brazil what we call a kind of foro privilegiado, stand privilege. And after that, we have this Lava Jato operation that revealed in resume that bribes were being paid in contracts of Petrobras, our large state-owned company in Brazil, and one of the giants of the exploration of oil and gas in the world. And they were being paid in a systemic way. It was not isolated cases, but in almost every contract in Petrobras, bribes were being paid for the directors, for the CEO, for some managers, and part of these bribes were being paid to high politicians who were responsible for the nomination and to keep these managers, directors, and CEO at their positions. The investigation had some evolution, and it revealed that the corruption was spread in Brazil. Everyone has some notion about that, but it's different when you see the evidence, the cases, the concrete numbers. And well, this also helped to change things a little in Brazil. So a lot of these criminals were tried and punished, and a great part of them were sent to jail. During the investigation, it was also discovered that some of these Brazilian companies who paid bribes also to Brazilian authorities also paid bribes all over Latin America to foreign public employees, for example, in Peru, in Colombia, in Ecuador. And we share this evidence with our counterparts in these countries, and they started their cases. In some of these countries, they were successful. In others, not so much. In 2018, however, these efforts against corruption, we start to suffer some setbacks. I think that's undesirable, but it's a natural reaction by the ones who lose with the fight against corruption. And nowadays, I don't think we are in a very good position in Brazil on this matter. As I said, we suffer some setbacks from new decisions from our Supreme Court, some new legislation by our Congress, and also I agree with Rafael when he speaks about populism in Latin America. I think this is a big problem if you have a populism from the right or from the left, and it's sometimes hard to avoid this speech against corruption, to avoid the capture of this speech by populists. I always understand the car wash operation and the anti-corruption movement as something to strengthen the rule of law, to make our economy healthier, and also to strengthen our democracy. But sometimes there are people who don't see the anti-corruption in this way and try to take it as a kind of political advantage. But probably the main lesson of the fight against corruption in Latin America is that we have to strengthen our institutions. Of course, individuals are important. Individual efforts against corruption are very important, but you have to work harder on issues like the rule of law, on democracy, on the independence of the courts of law, of the autonomy of our public prosecutors, and also about the autonomy of the police organizations. Well, despite of these setbacks now, I also believe in what Laura said, that we need to see the large picture. And we have advances in our region in the last 30 years on matters of transparency, on matters of the free press. It plays an essential role in the fight against corruption and for democracy. And even with these setbacks, I think the direction is established. So we probably will have in the future or the near future new advances in the region. I think this is very important to strengthen our democracy and to strengthen our economy. And well, we also have this international movement against corruption, a lot of pressure from the international community to have more, less corruption and to have open markets and against bribery in international commercial transactions. So this also has an impact in our countries. So I think if you look to the future, we could have a lot of hope. Of course, it depends also on our efforts to build strong institutions against corruption, against populism, against any kind of manipulation of this discourse. So for my introduction, it's that.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I want to now advance on the things that you said on your initial statements. The three of you talk about how a politician could use this anti-corruption investigation for their own purposes. How the public will probably believe that the corruption of the other guy is terrible, but not the corruption of the people of my party. No, so that's obviously a problem. And I want you to speak about that. How do you address this problem and the independence of the people that are in the anti-corruption movement? For example, Laura, you were head of the anti-corruption office. That is a position of confidence of the president in Argentina. Before that, you were a congresswoman of Macri's party. Do you believe that a politically appointed post can really fight corruption and be credible with the public in this fight? Because the first target of any anti-corruption office will be, of course, the same government, or it would be better to have more independence and not to have a politically appointed post in a position like that?
I think that the most important thing is to have an independent judiciary and independent prosecutors. You can be an agency depending on the executive doing some advice work. For example, the Office of Ethics, Governmental Ethics in the US has always done has been an advisor of the president and the federal public officials throughout the government in the US. So that's a part of the ecosystem of institutions within a country. You can have different institutions. For example, in Argentina, there is no ethics authority within the judiciary, for example. There is no ethics authority within the Congress. And if we go to the subnational governments, the situation is worse. So that's why when I spoke about second bests, if you ask for perfection in political systems where perfection is not the norm, you are always be a frustrated person asking for something that you will never get. So from my position, what I did was to promote a lot of new laws and regulations that were not there before. We created a national anti-corruption plan for the executive. It was signed by a presidential decree. It's an executive order, and it's stated there. So now this government has to do something with that book, because it's not only a book, it's more than 100 initiatives for transparency and integrity in the federal government. So, the main task to go after corruption is for prosecutors and judges. But there is also a body or bodies or agencies for the policy making in favor of transparency, modernization, and the prevention of corruption. And I think that's the part of what Rafa was saying with regards to understanding the systems and the structures and the incentives for corruption and trying to bring reforms in order to make that corruption more expensive, you know, to lift up the price of the cost of the transaction.
And to
So,
follow with Rafael, is there any way, Rafael, to have more long-term policies in anti-corruption that don't depend on one government in the right, one government in the left? Because I think that maybe in Argentina, we have now a new president and a new appointee in your former post, Laura, and it's having policies that are different of what you have. Is there any way to have more long-term policies in countries?
So just to, so we can get into the details of this, etc. But I think it's well understood that the systems don't have an anchor in the end if there is no judicial system. So I have to agree. I like to disagree with people, so I am a little uncomfortable in this meeting. But I have to agree with what Laura is saying. It's, you know, if you don't have an independent, proficient judiciary, it's not going to work. It's very hard. You know, there are like lots of interesting, clever variations of how to structure our societies, but in the end, they don't really work. So, because people are particularly interested in high-level corruption, and those high-level corruption cases can only be discerned in a court of law. And the big problem that we have faced for a long time is that the judicial system is not very good at generating ways of evaluating itself, of improving. So because they are independent, they take it as a synonym of, like, you know, you can't really, they can do anything. So if you talk to some of the people who work in the judicial systems, it's extraordinary the levels of like incompetence or like craziness that they tolerate of their own people. So it's kind of interesting that the system itself cannot really, has not been very good at purifying itself. And besides honest and diligent judges, there are some judges which are simply buffoons. And these judges really destroy the credibility of the system. And there is a problem in some of the legal systems of trying to purify that part. Now, that happens with lots of good judges who work more in silence. But there are these like very visible cases where you have like very, very politicized or corrupt judges that I think it's not, the system has not been very good at dealing. And like, you know, from the point of view of the rhetoric, I don't have a good answer. I simply, when somebody wants to tell me about corruption, I always tell them, like, you know, tell me about the corruption of your guy and I will believe you. Anything else is just like you know, beating your chest and telling me something, you know, how pure you are. And just like say you're pure and it's shorter.
Sergio, I want to jump with Sergio about that. Because Sergio, you made a very controversial move, you know, when you accepted a post in the cabinet of President Bolsonaro, who was the main beneficiary with Lula's conviction. And that is being used by Lula's followers to say that your investigation was politically driven and was politically biased. Why did you accept this post in the cabinet? And looking in retrospective, was that a mistake?
So, before I answer this question, let me just say one thing, and a little anecdote. One of the main criminals involved in Lava Jato was a director of Petrobras named Paulo Roberto Costa. And he was arrested in the beginning of the case, and the police also made a search and seizure. And they found at that time a small diary in his house, and they inside the diary they find a phrase of one of our writers, a famous writer in Brazil, Miller Fernandez, and the phrase is, the fight against corruption is the main goal of those who are out of the government. I thought it was very funny. But just me say something, I don't think we need to address the problem of corruption by several means. Fighting, punishment, and privation are not alternative strategies that you need to choose between one of them. You could work on prevention at the same time work on punishment. About the question about the former President Lula, who was convicted for corruption. I delivered the sentence in 2017. I didn't know at that time the candidate Bolsonaro, and no one believed that he could go to, he could run and have a victory for the presidents of Brazil. And the conviction was upheld by the appeal court, and the conviction was upheld by the Superior Court in Brasilia, the Superior Justice Court in Brasilia. So it's not only my decision. And after I left the judiciary, another judge delivered other sentence in other case convicting the former president. And I always believe that as a judge, I thought I was doing, sorry to say that, a good work trying out these cases, applying the law and considering the evidence. But I always believe that you cannot have permanent results against corruption without changing the law, without strengthening the institutions. So I was invited by the president, Bolsonaro, after the election, and I saw then an opportunity to bring my work in Curitiba to Brasilia and to try to build something more solid about it. So that's I went to the government with this, with good faith and with this intention. I try to do my best as a minister. I think we reached some good results, but the reaction against the anti-corruption movement was very strong. So unfortunately, we did not have the political power enough to improve our legislation to fight against corruption. And after that, I had some disagreements with the president about some concrete issues. I don't want to go in details in this presentation, and I left the government. At the moment that I saw that it was impossible to go further with a reformist agenda for anti-corruption, I left. So, of course, there are a lot of controversy about the President Bolsonaro. But when I went to the government, they make some polls about my decision, and well, the large majority of Brazilian populations approved my decision to go to the government. And I also me going to the government, not only to continue the fight against corruption, but also to be a kind of a guarantee for the rule of law in a government that some people see with a lot of reservation because of the past of President Bolsonaro. So it was a difficult decision, hard decision. What I can say, I understand that some people don't understand, but I went there in good faith to do my best.
Don't you think that decision weakened or was detrimental for the credibility of the investigation of corruption?
I don't think I need to make decisions in my life based in lies. So, for example, the President Lula and his allies always use this political card and as an alibi, but he was convicted based on evidence. And I saw the opportunity to do something in more general terms at a position in the government. So that's why I went there. And the work of Lava Jato case continue in the hands of other judges. So
I wanna, yeah,
as
I
a
want to
great
advance,
problem.
yeah, I want to advance to other topic. Rafael talked about the structures that made corruption more possible. So let's talk about the corruptors, like the moguls that have the money and the interest to buy politicians, to corrupt public institutions for their own benefit. As we know, Latin America is the more unequal continent of the world. An enormous amount of money is in very few hands. Do you think that the concentration of money in the hands of a few people is maybe a relevant element in corruption? How can we fight this difficult? Maybe Laura can be first.
Maybe that's a question for the economists in the group. I'm not so sure, because it's always the same. Who are the corrupt? Are the politicians? Are the private companies? Are the monopolies or the oligopolies? You can find good people in everywhere doing the right thing. Even a lot of private sector or companies struggling in very high corruption environments and not being corrupt, which is very difficult for a business to operate, where there are a lot of restrictions and regulations at international level and in the capital markets to get money and to get investors. If you are a corrupt company, it's more complicated. So first, I want to congratulate Sergio Moro, because it's not very easy to abandon the judiciary and go into a government. I passed for the same situation. I was member of the chapter of Transparency International before being a member of Congress. And it's very comfortable to stay in the NGO and criticize politicians or public officials or judges and not taking the lead. So, when you move into that place, it's a jungle. So, I think he made it's very important that the judge decides to become a policymaker, which is part of the discussion we had here. It's not only the judges are, I always thought when a judge appears, it's because we failed. We failed with regulations, we failed with transparency, we failed with oversighting, we failed with parliamentary control on the budget. So it's about regulations. For example, here we passed during the Macri administration 3 laws that I think are key. And it was very difficult because the Macri administration was in minority in both houses. We passed the Access to Information Law and we created the agency. We passed the corporate liability legislation, and now companies in Argentina are criminally liable for corruption, domestic corruption, not only transnational. And we also passed the repentant or whistleblower legislation. So that creates a new, from my point of view, a new set of incentives for corrupt people in the private and the public sector. And we have to wait. We don't know what's going to happen, but now maybe one day some guy appears in front of a prosecutor saying, I want to confess, I participated or I saw corruption and I want to give you the evidence and my vision of what happens. So this is new. These are new incentives. And I think this is what, in a way, Rafa was speaking about structures and systems and incentives. Also, electronic filing in public procurement, it's something that is happening now in Argentina, as happened before, many, many years before in Chile. 5 years ago in Argentina, procurement was paper-based. So imagine the inefficiency and corruption of a contract and the discussion of huge amounts of money in contracts with inflation in a paper-based mode. So I think that this changes regulations. This is the part I did more, not chasing Mrs. Kirchner, which is one part of the truth, which for me, it's not truth. I invested 80% of my time and resources in policymaking, not in prosecuting or going after the prosecution of any public official. For that, you have prosecutors and judges.
Thank you very much, Laura. Laura is agree on the possibility of a judge going to the government. I'm in minority here clearly, but I want to listen also, Rafael, to the issues we are talking about.
lots of interesting things. What was your question about? Your question was about like the structure.
Yeah, about the concentration of wealth in a very few hands.
Oh yeah.
That will be a driver for corruption.
Yeah. So the answer is I think yes. The way I see the structure, the structural problems of corruption have to do with some forces that generate more corruption and the demand of people for bad policies. So people all the time want more regulation, more taxes, more, and it's interesting. So that's that has occupied a lot of my time. So I'm super interested in that problem. So for me, like I'm interested in the following fact, which is like, if I show you a picture of this great business person in the US, so this is an experiment I'm going to report to you that I did. So in the US, if I show you a picture of Bill Gates, etc., and then I ask you, do you want more regulation? Do you want more, what should the taxes to the top 1% be? And they give you like a number. If you do the same thing with another group, and instead of showing them a picture of Bill Gates, you show them a picture of Ken Lay or some bad business person. The answer is they want more regulation and more taxes to the top 1%, even if they know that regulation generates more corruption. And that's kind of like the key paradox. And I think the answer for that is that they want to punish these bad business people. One of the unique things about Latin America is that we have this catastrophic opinion about business people. So there are this, like, there is a force to try to straighten out the system. But each time people in general see a terrible business person who's this mogul who pays bribes and laughs at it and is like in bed with all the politicians, etc., they want more regulation because they don't want to give this guy a good business environment, without realizing, I think, that generates the conditions for more corruption in the future. So it's like a poverty trap. We are caught in a poverty trap between the business lack of legitimacy, the desire for more regulation, and more corruption, which kind of like generates more bad business again. And that that's been one of the tragedies of Latin America, and we can't seem to get out of that. We have a very overregulated economy, extremely overtaxed in many different ways, and people don't, in fact, they want more. And because they want punishment, they want like a Teddy Roosevelt to come along, etc. So my own personal take on these figures who come from the legal system and try to straighten is more positive than you have, Daniel. It's not that I like Sergio. I don't have like an personal opinion on Sergio, but I think I like the idea of reformists or people who are seen by lots of people as very honest and doing their duty, and who have produced, like Sergio, a conviction, and other people have like ratified. So some people seem to share Sergio's take on it. To go into politics and then clean out. Those seem to be moments where you can go to a more virtuous equilibrium with less regulations, less corruption, etc. So I applaud the occasionally the way that some of these figures appear. And by the way, Daniel, just to be fair to Sergio, in America, there are occasionally these figures that appear. Eliot Spitzer, Teddy Roosevelt, etc. And those characters push the boundaries of the law quite a bit, much more than I think the evidence shows that Moro did on some of the Latin American reforms. We go by the book, I think, compared to the Americans. The Americans are much more like into the results, less. So I think, just to be fair to us, our reformists, and Moro is an example, are a little bit more tame than the American ones when you see what the Americans do, which I have some admiration for some of the things that Spitzer and Roosevelt did. But they really push the boundaries much more than our guys.
Yeah. Well, Teddy Roosevelt is maybe a kind of good populism, no? We can say that he has a kind of populism that worked in order to have a better distribution of power, have a better free market in the United States. But when I go back to Sergio, you were basically prosecuting corruption in a monopoly like Petrobras, a very, very huge company, a state-owned company in that case. What do you think about concentration of power, concentration of wealth, and the relation with corruption? You have the
As I said, corruption is about risk and opportunities, and you need to work on both sides. You have to strengthen the law, the punishment, make the punishments harder sometimes. The courts of law they have to work and do their part of the job with punishments after, of course, the trial. But you can also work on prevention. Sometimes excess of regulation, excess of tax are a real problem. I agree with Rafael. And having a closed market, monopolies, they also sometimes contribute for schemes of bribery or corruption. So you have to use a lot of strategies. Sometimes opening your market, approving reforms for fair competition, and reforming the bidding process. This could work. I like the example of Ted Roosevelt. Ted Roosevelt was sometimes he had a populist discourse, but he was a progressive, and he worked in several reforms in the United States, and also he was a defender of punishment in cases of corruption. I always remember he has a very strong speech against corruption he delivered before the Congress in 1903, and very hard one against corruptors and officials who take bribes. And one of things that caught my attention in that speech is that he make a strong connection between corruption and democracy, saying that he used that phrase of Lincoln, government by the people, for the people, and he said that corruption undermined the democracy and the autonomy, self-government, and brings prejudice to the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I think this is the right speech to make the right connection. You cannot have a fight against corruption out of democracy. The fight against corruption strained our economy. It's important to say that because here in Brazil, one of the criticisms against Lava Jato was that it was one of the causes of the recession of 2014, 2015, and I think this is completely wrong analysis. But sometimes you need to fight back this kind of speeches. So as I said, reforms are important in several ways. Punishment is important, but also prevention. And there are not strategies that you have to choose only between one of them. You need to do everything at the same time. Thank you for the words about going to the government. It was a very hard decision. But I met some judges of the Manipulate case in the last years, and like in Brazil, they have a large operation against bribery in Italy. But I met them, and all of them seems to me a little bit disappointed because Manipulate creates a lot of expectations about Italy, that Italy would become a country with more integrity in politics, in the markets. And I'm not doing any critic now about Italy, but they all regret that it didn't happen the way that they believe it would. And so I see the opportunity to go to the government to, wow, keep working on this in this cause. It's cause of a life. And it was a new president that was elected with a strong speech against corruption just after the car wash operation. So I have great expectation about that. And I keep my, I continue to have faith on that. That's one of the reasons that I leave the government. When I see that it was not possible to advance in this government, I just left. I did not go to the government because of the political power or the position of minister. I went there to do my job in what I believe. And I saw that it was not possible, I left.
Okay, we have just 15 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions for the audience. So I will take some of the questions for you, and please brief answers so we can hopefully answer a lot of questions. There's one for Laura from Liam Cohen. Laura, you have spoke about your time working under the executive, creating anti-corruption policies and the importance of a strong independent judiciary. If you don't have an independent judiciary, it's very difficult to enforce anti-corruption regulation. Why would you say the legislature has not enacted many of these anti-corruption laws to create more transparency in the political and economic system in, let's say, Argentina, for your cause?
Some laws were enacted, but I want to comment on what Rafael said about overregulation and overtaxing businesses and what the people think about the private sector and investments and the market. And we have a very illiberal society within us. We are part of that. So Rafa, for example, is a very weird Argentinian living in the US. And I'm also very weird Argentinian because the majority of the people want regulation. They think that more laws and more decrees and more taxes make things better. And you are from Chile, Daniel, so that's a bit different. And it's not weird that you think that Sergio could have stayed in the judiciary, and I could have, I should have stayed at the NGO, because Chile is different from the rest of us, probably. I'm not so sure. I think that you have very good marketing.
In some things, we have very good marketing indeed. Yeah, we have some. Yeah. We have problems too. Let's say it's only one thing. But it's only one thing worse that have many politicians in jail is to have none in jail, and that's our problem.
But again, we go. You know really. What? Again, we go to the origin of this conversation. It's not the persons. It's the incentives. And maybe it's the institutions that we have created. And we have created imperfect institutions and imperfect institutional environments. So that's why usually I quote Susan Rose Ackerman about rivalry agencies, which look very similar. For example, the anti-corruption office I presided and the prosecutor's office that investigates corruption. Because when you have imperfect systems, you create different remedies that pop up in different political moments. So in general, I think that, when we discuss about corruption, it's very frustrating because it's the same thing about discussing poverty in Latin America. And it's a problem. And it's a structural problem. And we have, and it's political. At the end, it's a power issue. And in our country, we know that poverty and corruption are hand in hand, and they have a lot to do with votes, because there are some people that want poverty because poverty brings votes, and they are reelected and reelected and reelected again. So then when we go and see what's going on with the judiciary and independence, it's very difficult for independent judges to survive in an environment where corruption and non-independence and the lack of integrity is not the norm. I want to emphasize this. That's why when you find the Sergio Moro, or you find a couple of prosecutors or judges in Argentina that are doing things right, instead of criticizing them, you have to protect them. And it's not what happens. Like really, media and public, public opinion, and some people punishes publicly people that are doing things right and are also taking high risk to leave their comfortable seats at NGOs, universities, or maybe the judiciary, because they are taking the risk to do reform. So I don't think that we will have Teddy Roosevelts here in Latin America, but at least we have to highlight the people that have taken the risk to do things right. And at the end, we have, we have written some chapters in the history of this region that are different of the rest of the story. So I can tell you a different story about Argentina and anti-corruption during my years, almost 20 years, but in the last 4. And well, I know that we can say a lot about what Sergio Moro did. And also we have to think about the general institutional environment and liberal democracies, and if we really have a liberal society or not. I think that we are still in the struggle, and this is more like updated because it's everywhere. We are in the struggle of nurturing liberal values in our societies that will go into the market and into politics. But we have a lot of conservative waves of authoritarians that are using the mask of the liberal democracy. And I think that at the end, corruption and anti-corruption is playing in that bigger game, which is liberal democracy versus the rest. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I have a question for Rafael. Rafael, or Professor in Chicago, Luigi Zingales, asked the following. I do not think it's difficult for economists to explain why people do not trust experts, as you say, and independent central bankers. It is called capture. If the experts and independent central bankers is too aligned with that of a small elite, people do not trust experts and independent central bankers. What do you think about it?
Luigi sent that? Is that I didn't hear who's
yeah, Luigi Zingales.
All right. So the answer is yeah. So I agree. Like, but you're picking on two very weird economists. So I happen to agree with Luigi on this one, and I am completely in a minority, and so is Luigi. So I better be clear on that part. I think I completely share the sentiment behind the view that economists have been pushing agendas that are aligned with their values as if they were good and effective. So there's like for example, let me just be clear about one thing. I cannot stand capital controls. I just want to be clear with you. I can't stand capital controls. I think they are just a pain in the ass. That just was I clear? Okay. A different question is whether, do I think capital controls sometimes help you accomplish what you want to do and I have to give you the answer, yes. Now, economists in general mix the two. So if you ask me about capital controls, I tell you now capital controls are an ineffective way of, I have to say, not always. So I think the reason why these experts have been peddling bad policies that like people suspect they've been like I don't know, cheerleaders for globalization, etc., is because they kind of like mix their values and their beliefs. So that's one point. I would still want to ask Luigi, how does he think we come to that confusion? So we know we have lots of colleagues who are very well-intentioned and nice, etc., and who are like pushing forward some of these notions in ways that are cheerleaders for globalization, for example, and they don't see themselves as corrupt or captured. So the model that Luigi is pushing, I would say it's incomplete. Somebody has to, be able to explain what they're doing to themselves at least. And I don't see Luigi's model as consistent with what my friends who are pushing for, liberalization of capital controls think of themselves. They don't see themselves as captured. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that I think that Luigi has to improve that model. He has to face up with one fact, which that model is not taking into account, which is that, of course, everybody wants somebody who's not captured, but with equal knowledge about whether you are captured or not. The question is, do you want somebody who's more intelligent? And the answer that I'm reporting to Luigi is that the populist voters don't really like the smart guys. So I don't find that an easy way problem to model. I have a model that I produced with Julio Rothenberg on this, which is that like people don't like to feel betrayed. So the smart guys make you feel worse all the time because it's more likely that you were betrayed if you are in a bad state of the world. But it's a very complicated model. I don't want to push that too hard. I want to make sure that my answer to Luigi is that his model is big picture right, but incomplete.
Okay, so we will need to organize a new webinar with Rafael and Luigi to discuss this, the topic of economic capture more in detail, because it's fascinating.
Whenever you want.
Yeah, we have time for a last question for Sergio. Is Freddy Bregueiro. He said, we've seen several countries in Latin America experiencing similar problems when judges and prosecutors try to fight corruption. Is there any kind of task force that could be built in conjunction with these countries in order to share experiences and to take practical action to fight corruption, to have a transnational fight against corruption in Latin America?
Before I answer the question, let me just remember a point. Theodore Roosevelt, who it seems that everyone here is a kind of fan, he was an accidental president. He was vice president, and he took the position only because the president, William McKinley, was murdered. He would never be chosen by his party to run as a president, at least in the first term. In the second term, he was already the president, so he had a lot of political force. It's interesting to see that sometimes very hard to put the right persons at the right positions, at least on these higher ones. During the Lava Jato operation, the prosecutors in Brazil, they established a lot of good contacts with their counterparts in other countries like Peru, Ecuador, not so much in Argentina. Sorry to say that. It was a little bit difficult. Panama. So they share the evidence that they receive in the investigation in Brazil. So in these other countries, the prosecutors could develop their own cases. This helps because international cooperation is essential to fight corruption nowadays. We have a lot of cases involving international bribery in commercial transactions. We have also, we usually need assistance from countries like Switzerland, where criminals move their criminal assets to there. There are some discussion, but small yet, about international corruption court, like the International Penal Court. There is a federal judge in the United States. His name is Mark Wolf, that he tried to defend the creation of a court like this, an international court, to address the problem of corruption, considering the failure of local courts to do that. I'm not sure if it's right now an idea that could be get out of paper, but at least in all these cases involving international cooperation, it seems that in Latin America, the prosecutors, even the judge, they are talking more with each other. When I was a judge in these Lava Jato cases, sometimes I went to other countries like Argentina, like Peru, and I had great opportunities to talk with the judicial community and share experience. I think this is important because what happened in Latin America, some of these countries not only receive the evidence, to build their own cases, but also they start to look to Brazil and think, well, Brazil always had the difficulty to face corruption and to punish this kind of behavior, but now they're doing it. They're and we face the same difficulties. But if Brazil is doing, I can do it also. So sometimes this is positive when you see your neighbor doing things that you also need to do, and you say, oh, if they are doing, I can do also. So in certain way, Lava Jato helped not only to spread this evidence about corruption, but to generate a wave of anti-corruption in our region. And some countries did very well. I can say about Peru, for example. They worked very hard to build their own cases, and well, it involved also 4 former presidents there.
Yeah, it was
not a trivial thing.
Yeah, it's very impressive what happens in Peru in this moment. Sergio, Rafael, Laura, thank you very much for being here with us. And thank you for all the audience that was with us today. And well, we're on time, so buenas tardes. Thank you very much to all of you, and we'll see you in another occasion here at the Stigler Center.
Bye.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.